Well, there's a really interesting music school, weekend music school for kids, just round the corner from where I lived. So the minute it became clear, I was, I was hook, line, and sinker, and obsessed with the drums. My parents just used to drop me off at this music school on Saturday mornings, pick me up on Sundays. So.
Well, I appreciate your time. I'm Adam, and this is a podcast about you and your journey in music. And obviously, we'll talk about the new album, which is amazing. I had a chance to hear it all the way through, and Black Sheep. I think that's my favorite song on the record.
Brilliant. Yeah, several people have said that, which surprised me because it's quite a slow burner.
Yeah, but that piano piece in the beginning is so awesome.
Cool.
Yeah. So I mean, I really love the record. And even because it does go through. I mean, there's more upbeat songs, and then there's slow songs, and we'll dive into the album obviously as well. But first off, where were you born and raised?
I was born in Colchester, which is a town in the east of England, about 100 miles northeast of London.
Okay. And what was it like growing up there? Was it like I'm so unfamiliar. Is it like a big city, suburb? Like, what's the vibe?
No, it was, when I was born there, it was a relatively small market town, but 100 miles is a funny distance in the UK, because in the kind of 1970s and 1980s, they electrified the railways, upgraded all the railways, and suddenly you could be in London in under an hour, as opposed to it taking much longer than that before. And so all of these towns within an hour's journey from London suddenly became sort of London overspill suburbs. So it went from being this small market town where literally the farmers in the surrounding countryside used to bring their produce into the town on Saturdays to sell at the big market in the city centre. All of that got knocked down, and housing estates just got started, just began to be built on the outskirts of the town ad infinitum. They're still being built now.
Yeah.
So a kind of quite a cozy little sleepy town when I was born there, but it became increasingly like a suburb of London as I grew up there.
That's interesting that those trains must go pretty quick. I mean, to make it 100 miles in an hour. I mean, that's literally 100 miles an hour.
Maybe it's less than 100 miles. I guess.
But still, I mean, that's
absolutely no idea how far away it is. But certainly within that kind of,
Sure. I mean,
radius.
yeah, the trains here I feel like don't go nearly that, but that's crazy. That's cool. I did read you're from quite a musical household.
Yeah, both my parents were classical musicians. Briefly, it has to be said, my mum was a violinist, but she they were both quite badly burned by the classical music industry, which in the 1960s, 1950s and 60s was a pretty grim place. Especially if my mum was a young, pretty blonde woman violinist, and you could just imagine what she had to put up with in the 1960s. So yeah, and also it was and is to less an extent now, but still a little bit, it was quite an uncreative place. You were expected to bring your virtuosity to every session, but you were basically expected to use it to play the notes from the page exactly as instructed to you by the conductor. So you were a kind of copy typist, reproducing the notes on the page, and if there was any creativity, it was going to be the conductor's creativity and not yours. So I think they both.
So yeah, you're pretty much, it was play these notes, and if I want to make it go in a different direction, then I'll let you know.
Yeah. If I want you to play it differently, I will tell you. And it's still a bit like that. And orchestras to some extent have to be like that. So it has to be somebody's vision, but it's nowhere near as bad as it used to be. Orchestras used to be terrified of the conductor, who would be on a bad day. There would be psychopaths, just determined to make everybody's life a misery for the entire session, you know. And it's like a story I once heard about. Now I think I've got this story right, but it was Beethoven who had an orchestra that he wrote his music for, and he found out at one point that the French horn player one of the French horn players was having an affair with his wife. So he then made the French horn parts the most difficult parts he could possibly imagine to get his revenge, virtually unplayably difficult, you know. So I guess things have always been thus in the classical music industry to some extent.
That's funny. I wonder if he's trying to do it to have a reason to kick him out, maybe.
Yeah.
Keep away from his wife.
Yeah, or if not, just to make his working day absolutely miserable.
Oh, that's pretty funny. Oh, wow. And your father he worked for BBC, but was he also a musician?
Yeah, he was a singer, but he joined the RAF, joined the Air Force in his early 20s, and was a radio instructor, I guess. He taught pilots on their pilot courses, the radio part of their course. And like many people in the RAF, when he'd finished his service, he joined the BBC. That was a kind of a standard career path, really. Mm-hmm. And that's where he met my mum, who'd given up playing the violin and had become a secretary in the typing pool, as there used to be in the 1960s at the BBC. So yeah, my dad ended up being, he started off being a sound engineer. That was his first job, because he was quite technical. And in those days, mixing desks, had great big knobs on and kind of dials and things like that. It wasn't now like the sort of transistorized things of today. But so he engineered some of the early sessions by bands like the Beatles and Cliff Richard before they were famous. He used to do 2 or 3 sessions a week, and there'd be a steady stream of bands coming through that he had to work with, and they were all pretty unknown in those days. This is kind of must have been the
oh my gosh,
early 60s.
Yeah.
So yeah, I met Paul McCartney much later on. A few years ago, I met him, and I told him how proud my dad had been of engineering some of his sessions, and how he dined out on that ever since, really. And
wow, he must have been so struck by that to have your dad working with him before they were the biggest band in the world, or of all time, pretty much.
No, he was very, very generous, and asked me to remember him to my dad, as if I needed to do that, and say thank you very much, which I did.
That's incredible. Which I love about the album itself, and just kind of about your story and your father working in radio. Is like, I come from radio. I did it for up to 17 years before I started really doing this podcast full time. And I love that you used to, from what I was reading in your bio, you would build radios with your father. Like, see, I worked in it for so long, but I just, the fact that you can just turn a microphone on and like, there's so much stuff happening that's sending the signal, and then it's going out to everyone. Like, I have no concept of it. All I knew was I worked in San Diego, and our signal was in Mexico. And the cool thing about our station is we didn't really have to abide as much by the FCC, and we had to play the Mexican national anthem a couple times a day, and their propaganda commercials, and which I thought was pretty cool. But I worked in terrestrial radio in San Francisco as well, but it was like, I still can't even like fathom like what is even happening. Like, the fact that you could build those, that blows my mind.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The radio is counterintuitive stuff. My dad took away from the RAF and his early experiences with the BBC this love of electronics that stayed with him his entire life, and he passed that on to me. But one of the things he tried to impress on me was the kind of electric circuits you build as a child, you know, where you connect a battery to a light bulb and a switch, and you switch the switch and the light bulb lights. Kind of radio frequency circuits behave in a very, very different way. It's much less clear whether the switch is on or off. There's you know, things and especially things like antennae, which is just a long piece of wire not connected to anything, you know, an antenna. Well, that shouldn't work, should it? I thought things had to be a circuit, you know. How the hell could that possibly work?
Right.
You know, all that stuff is like really quite weird, and understanding it takes you to a kind of more fundamental understanding of how the universe works. You know, it's the whole thing. Radio is some of the most interesting stuff, and yet it's the foundation of the modern world, really. Almost all the things, the labor-saving things that we rely on these days, have hidden radio transmitters and receivers in. You know, your phone is basically a radio transmitter and receiver. You know, it's radio that enables us to make something happen over the other side of the room whilst we're sitting on the sofa. You know, we just completely take it for granted now. You know, Bluetooth in our watches and connecting those to our phones, connecting that to our laptop. All of this is radio. So it's absolutely fundamental to the way we live our lives today. And there's a very, very famous quote by Arthur C. Clarke, you know, the sort of futurist, I suppose you'd call him, a science fiction writer and futurist. He was another interesting guy. He actually dreamed up the maths behind Earth orbiting satellites, you know, and he was a science fiction writer. But anyway, he said that beyond a certain level of technological sophistication, he said technology is indistinguishable from magic. That was the key line in his scientific thinking and his kind of thinking about how science affects people. And I've often mused on that because it's quite an interesting, multi-layered statement. And it's interesting why it's indistinguishable from magic, really. Because when you watch a magician work, he goes, or she goes, and over there, you know, something levitates. That's the magical thing for us, because for the entirety of our existence up until now, that's been impossible to do. It's been impossible to wave your hands here and the thing over there to levitate. It's only in the last couple of 100 years that that's actually been a possibility, you know. And it's radio that does that. It's the discovery of radio allows us to have this kind of action at a distance, the thing that has been baffling humankind for millennia, you know. And that still seems to us, because this is hardwired into our psyche, it still seems to us to be a magical thing. You know, we still, even though we know there's got to be some strings attached, when the magician does that, we're still going, wow, that's amazing. We know that he had the thing he's levitating or she's levitating has to be attached to some wires. We know it does, but we're still hardwired to go, wow, you know. And the same is true of radio. That the more we sit down and think about it, the more we understand about how it all works and how it's all woven into our life. Certainly for me, the more I go, wow, it's just wonderful. It's just extraordinary, kind of the gift it's given to humanity. So yes, as you can tell, I'm a passionate radio enthusiast, radio technology enthusiast, and I still do the building radios thing. I also build audio equipment for my studio. I build fun little electronic projects for a laugh. And I try and pass on my passion for it as it was passed on to me.
Are you able to, I mean, on like this album, are you building your own sort of, you know, musical, like, I mean, like, I don't know, like transistor type things that will make sounds that nobody else could probably recreate because you built it?
There are two things you can do, really. You can either design something from scratch in the hope that it's going to sound interesting. There's no real guarantees that it is. Or you can take somebody else's design and you can modify it. And so that's what I tend to do more of these days. I let somebody else do the hard design work. Then I trace around the circuit diagram, see if I can figure out how it works. and how I can hack it somehow to customize it to how I want to do. But that's the kind of project you can do in a weekend. The other one takes 3 months, the designing it from scratch thing. So
Sure.
I'd rather be making music than doing that these days. But that's what my dad and I used to do. That's electronic engineering rather than electronics, really. That's the bit that but that's what my dad used to do around a kitchen table. There are standard designs for radios, and he would say, but if you swap this bit out, put this bit in, and then you change the values of those resistors there, look what happens. So that kind of tinkering and experimentation can be really exciting also.
Yeah, it's just so fascinating, especially thinking now, like, oh yeah, like you Bluetooth to a speaker and you can play a song from your phone. Like, it is all radio signals and sending one thing to another thing. Like, it's wild.
Much of what we do was invented by amateur tinkerers. I mean, radio itself was discovered by amateur tinkerers, because all scientists in that a couple hundred years ago were amateur tinkerers, or 100 years ago. But since then, there's quite a big tradition of amateur tinkerers making earth-shattering discoveries in radio. Things like the kind of digital radio technology. The radio tinkerers had a version of the internet over the radio waves long before the internet, in packet radios it was called, long before the internet was unleashed on an unsuspecting public. So a lot of these things were innovations by people. We would call it hacking these days, we would call it open source. It's all quite sexy now, but we radio tinkerers have been doing that for a long time. It was radio tinkerers that put the first Western satellite in orbit around the Earth. Kind of all of that stuff has taken private enthusiasms to bring to fruition, really.
And you hold one of those licenses, don't you?
I do. I have you need if you want to design and build your own radios and use them on the air, you need a license which is supposed to guarantee you won't muck it up for everybody else.
Start some pirate radio station or something.
Yeah, whether it actually does guarantee that or not, I don't know. But you have to take some exams to show you understand how it all works, and they show you a circuit diagram. You have to explain what it is and what the various values of the components are likely to be, and all that kind of stuff.
That's so fascinating. Well, back to your music. What was the first instrument you learned? Was it
music? What's about radio? What are we talking about music for? Well,
I want to get back to radio, because when we talk about your album,
okay.
I like I said, I grew up, that was my favorite thing, and listening to the radio and the presenters and doing it myself, just thinking back blew my mind. But so I love that you're so into it. But with music, were the drums your first instrument?
No, my first instrument was the piano, but I was very young, and I hated the piano with a vengeance. They used to teach it in such a terrible way. They used to teach you to play scales first. This was like the 1970s. So I had to sit there with this piano teacher and endure playing scales over and over again. It was just so boring. So in fact, she was trying to teach me, I kind of loathe the lessons, but when I now realize she was trying to teach me to do something that would have given me joy for the rest of my life. But anyway, bless her. But anyway, so I thought, well, if I can negotiate my way out of these piano lessons somehow, I thought, well, if I can change the rules, you have to have piano lessons once a week, so you have to have a musical instrument lesson once a week, that I'll pick the most obnoxious instrument known to man, and they will be so aghast that they will drop the rule and go out and play football with my friends, which is what I wanted to do. So my first instrument after the piano was the bagpipes, which is
oh wow,
obviously is the most obnoxious instrument known to man, if played by an 11-year-old boy. But anyway, I unfortunately, even though Colchester, where I grew up, had some of the greatest bagpipe teachers in the world there, because a very famous Scottish regiment, the Black Watch, was stationed in Colchester at the time. And so didn't know it then, but it turns out the guy that was trying to teach me was one of the best bagpipe players in the entire world, you know. But you need a little weedy 11-year-old boy can't do the bagpipes. You need it's a fighting, shagging instrument. It's not a kind of you know, you need a adult's physique to play it, and even you need to have strong adult's physique as well to play it well. So that was that out of the window. So then I picked the second most obnoxious instrument known to man, which of course is the drums, and but got utterly obsessed with it. Like from day one, I knew I'd found something that you know, I fell so deeply in love with it that I basically did it every spare moment for the next kind of 20 years, really, and would got to the point where I would feel quite out of sorts if I wasn't able to play the drums for a few days. I was kind of went down that rabbit hole quite deeply.
Yeah. Well, once you start playing and picking it up, are you playing in like was that an instrument you could play at school in like their band or anything like that, or was it something that was mainly just done on your own free time?
Well, there's a really interesting music school, weekend music school for kids just around the corner from where I lived. So the minute it became clear I was you know, I was hook, line and sinker and obsessed with the drums, my parents just used to drop me off at this music school on Saturday mornings, pick me up on Sundays. So that was fantastic for them. You know, it's like one kid out of the door. Now what we do with the other one?
You would stay there? Like you'd stay the night there?
Yeah. Sometimes, yeah.
Wow.
Sometimes. In the summer, definitely. And it was great. I absolutely loved it. And so my first love was orchestral music. It was a classical music school, even though they had jazz lessons and wind band lessons and all kinds of other stuff. Fundamentally, it was an orchestra school for churning out orchestral players. So that was my first love, was playing in the orchestra, playing percussion in the orchestra, because it really is the greatest job, really, to get paid for sitting in the middle of the orchestra. Every 100 bars or so you have to whack something, but nobody really cares. You know, you're just sat there surrounded by all these players in the best seat in the house, because you're right next to the basses, which is where all the kind of visceral action is in the orchestra, you know, and it's absolutely wonderful. So I that was what I was going to do. I was going to be an orchestral percussionist, and I was developing a love of jazz and kind of sort of bluesy jazz, sort of melodic bluesy jazz. And so I was getting some players together, and I was going to sort of do that as a hobby. It's very precocious because, you know, I was very young, but then I discovered drum kits. Didn't have a drum kit in those days. I lucked out, managed to inherit one, and started playing a lot more pop music. And that was when I was discovering girls, and my classical ambitions went out the window, really. And there they have stayed ever since.
Yeah.
Didn't really rediscover them until, you know, I started composing for film and TV, and that's where I picked up my baton again. And luckily, all those orchestration lessons had come in really handy, because, you know, I understand orchestras, I understand how to write for orchestras, so, you know, that was all quite handy.
Was that years later when you started composing for TV?
Yeah, that was 7 or 8 years ago, actually.
Okay, so you were well into, you know, bands and playing and being successful in that. Okay.
Yeah.
Like when you started playing, you know, more of the pop music, were you in high school or anything? Like, did you start a band early on? Like, how does it eventually land, obviously, into Blur?
Yeah, I played really from the time I got a drum kit. I played in bands really for the rest of my life. You know, I was in when was that? I suppose I just started secondary school. I was about 11 or 12 years old. And yeah, I started forming bands. You know, the musicians in a school tend to hang out together, don't they, to some extent? And, you know, so we all knew each other. We all played in little bands together. And, you know, we would try and get gigs in the local pubs and bars and play at the end of term concerts and those kind of things. So yeah, and I just kind of, that was my thing really from then on. So I grudgingly went to the lessons and kind of did the minimum I had to do without getting thrown out of school. But all of my passion and all of my energy and enthusiasm went into playing music.
Did you know, like, was that something you wanted to do? Like, did you want to be in a band and tour the world and tour, was that kind of the hope, the end game for you?
That I wanted nothing else. Yeah, I didn't really care about anything else. That was all I was really interested in. Yeah.
So when do you meet the rest of the members of Blur, and like, was that, how many years later was that? Like, were you in like secondary school, college? Like, at what point does that band start?
Well, I'd known Graham he was one of the other musicians. When my net widened and I started playing with other musicians in the town, he was another well-known musician in the town. So we played in bands together, and we got to know each other reasonably well. And it was him that introduced me to Damon, funnily enough. Damon also grew up in the same town that we did, but sort of lived at the other end of the town. Never really knew who he was. And Graham had done some recording with him, and said you should come along to a gig and see him play, and I did, and it was immediately obvious that he was the songwriter as well as a player. Very, very few people that I was growing up with were songwriters. Really, the songwriting was a sort of secondary thing. People didn't really think it was very important. There are plenty of good songs out there. Why do you want to write some more? But it was immediately apparent that Damon had what almost all the other musicians in my town lacked. Really, it was the ability to write songs as well as he could play his instrument. He'd been practicing both of those things for a long time, rather than just the instrumental playing, which most of us had. I was writing songs by that point as well. I was the main songwriter in the band I was in, but I was.
But you were playing drums, but writing all the songs.
Yeah, but it was clear he was kind of light years ahead of where I'd got to. I just really figured out how to do it, to be honest. And that was long before the days when you could go to a school and take a degree in it. You had to kind of figure it out as you went along. So I was just getting the hang of it, where Damon obviously really had the hang of it. He was writing hooky songs with proper choruses. So I went to see him. I went hang around and met him after the gig and said, if you ever need a drummer, let me know. And he rang back in a couple of weeks and said, come down to London. I'm doing some more recording. Let's have a play together. So at that time, Graham's other guitarist, and his other instrument is saxophone. So he was actually the sax player in this band. There was a different guitarist and a different bass player. And so we may have done a couple of gigs in that format, but certainly we did some recording, because Damon had a job making tea in a recording studio in central London. So he had access to the studio whenever there wasn't a client in. So that's another very attractive thing about Damon at that time. Was like, wow,
sure, free recording.
So yeah, but then the guitarist and bass player trounced off in a huff, and Graham, rather reluctantly, it has to be said, agreed, just as on a trial basis. He wasn't really very interested in doing it, but he'd pick up the guitar. I think Graham's always found the guitar quite easy, so he'd much rather have a challenge. But anyway, he went, all right, I'll play guitar then. And he brought along Alex, who he lived next door to. It's the only other person really we knew in the area that played bass, and that was that. It was immediately obvious from that first rehearsal with the four of us that it was much better, and we were signed within a few months of that.
Wow, I was going to ask you, so you knew that there was something special about the band, more so than anything you had played in prior?
Yeah, absolutely. And it just underlines really what I've come to believe is a sort of universal truth about these things, that fundamentally it's about the chemistry as much as anything else. If the chemistry ain't right, it doesn't matter how good the players are, it just doesn't have that spark, doesn't have that magic. But if the chemistry's right, you can get away with being less than virtuoso performers, because the thing is greater than the sum of its, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The cliche I'm desperately groping for, but especially in pop music, where kind of instrumental virtuosity isn't really the thing. It's kind of passion and kind of image and all of those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
But all of that is as nothing if you don't have the chemistry. That's what I learned from that.
Yeah, I feel like the bands that have the same members had massive careers like you've had, like there has to be something there, and everyone's kind of probably has to check their own ego. Like if we want this to work, we all have to kind of work collectively. And I feel like a lot of bands or people don't have the same passion within that band, and that kind of splits people up, and then different bands almost form. Like a lot of interviews I've had, like it's the best players or the most passionate players in their town that kind of eventually get together and play and start something that's successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key is you have to play with everybody that you possibly can, because you never know who it's going to work with.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, to be successful, you're going to have to make compromises along the way as well. We sort of realized this early on, that we were going to have to slot into roles in the band and kind of to some extent swallow our egos.
Mm-hmm.
And leave some things to other people and not have an opinion about everything, and not start fights pointlessly, because that's the way bands finish. It's like the drummer goes, "Why?" I say, "Well, I shouldn't play the bass." Where's he saying, "Oh, agreement that we have to play bass on this"? I want to play bass, and the whole thing explodes. And we realized pretty early on that we were all good at particular things, and we should just concentrate on those and let other people do their jobs. And that's worked pretty well for us. There have been very few arguments along those lines. There've been arguments, but it's more like who the biggest arsehole is in the band. And it's me. I can't believe they think they're the biggest arsehole. But it's money's the other thing that splits bands up. And again, we just decided the day one, we decided what we would do if we were ever to make any money, and that's what we've stuck by. So we've never had that argument either, really.
Mm-hmm. That's important. You never think about the business aspect of it until you need to, right? I mean, having that kind of clear idea early on, and then you said you guys got signed fairly quickly. Like, did somebody? I don't want to stick on Blur too long, because I really want to talk to you about the album, but I'm just curious because it's obviously a big part of your journey. Just early on, you get signed. Like, was that based off just some shows that you had played? Did somebody come and see you? And then, like, what was kind of the big milestone, change everything success moment that you had in the beginning there?
Yeah, we just started playing all the venues that everybody plays in and around London, and they're the venues that the record companies went to see who the new bands were. It was a fairly tried and tested formula, really. And we got written about in Music Week, which is the big trade newspaper, as a kind of exciting young band. We had quite a crazy live show in those days. It was all quite chaotic on stage, to be honest. So it gave the journalists something interesting to write about. And then all the record companies just came to see us over the course of the next few months, and one put in an offer. It was a good label, Food Records.
Mm-hmm.
They just had some success with the band called Jesus Jones. And the head of the label used to play in a band called the Teardrop Explodes, an 80s band that we all really looked up to. So we thought that's great as well. Probably have some really good stories to tell when drunk, and boy did he have some good stories to tell. So it all happened very quickly. Once the chemistry was right, everything happened very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's always my advice to young players. Make sure your music is where the record companies are looking, or where the people you're trying to market yourself to is looking, because everybody in the music industry is desperate for the next big thing. that's everybody's job, is to find the next big thing. People get sacked if they don't find the next big thing and their rival does.
Mm-hmm.
So make sure your music is where they're looking, and it's usually pretty obvious. You know, it's not, doesn't usually take a degree to figure out where that is.
Sure. But it's ever changing, right? I mean, now where you're discovered is totally different than being the band at the club every night that the labels are coming to check out. Just the access to everybody.
Yeah. In those days it was far more live oriented than it is now. Now,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you want to get noticed by some blogs and you want your music on SoundCloud and that kind of thing. But again, everybody knows that it's not rocket science.
Right, exactly.
The sad thing is, if your music is on the, you know, if you are being talked about in those influential blogs and your music is in the right places online and the record companies aren't calling, that's because they ain't good enough. And that's the downside. You know, just because in our day, if you played the London circuit for 2 years and nobody had rung you up, that means you've got to start again. I mean, something isn't working.
Yeah, there's kind of an obvious time that you're like, okay, let's try something else.
Yeah.
The last question I have on Blur is just like, what was kind of the first? I mean, getting signed is obviously a huge thing, but just because you get signed to the label doesn't mean that your life is necessarily gonna change or that's gonna work in a bigger, you know, just the wider worldwide stage, so to speak. Like, was there a moment that happened right after that it kind of changed and you were like, wow, you're starting to see a lot more people show up? Or did you get a song on BBC, or was there something that really changed for you guys?
Well, the big moment was around the time of Park Life,
Mm-hmm.
where there were a few bands, us and Oasis and Pulp and a few more, that had been struggling indie bands up until that point, and then somehow the mainstream just seemed to shift overnight to accommodate us all, and where we couldn't even got in the charts one day, the next day we were number one.
Wow.
We won loads of Brit Awards, and as did Oasis, and you know, the whole thing kind of snowballed from there. We had this famous chart battle with them where we both released a single on the same day, and that was half the battle. The other half of the battle was who could dream up the wittiest and most cutting insults about the other lot. So you know, I think we won one of those, they won the other, but in the long term that was what did it for us. It pushed both bands up to the kind of bottom rung of the top ladder, really, which turned out to be a very, very long ladder indeed. But the downside of it was, if there is one, that it kind of joined both bands at the hip, really, you know. And so rarely does an interview go by these days where I've not asked about the Oasis question, which is why I usually get it out of the way early on myself, because the journalists hold it back in case it's still so annoying, the Oasis thing, that I might storm out of the interview and smash the radio studio.
Well, I didn't want to ask you about the Oasis thing. That's why I was like, just stay clear of it. I'm like, I'm sure that everyone's asked him that. I didn't even want to go there. I was just curious to see if but I knew Park Life obviously was a big thing, but if there was something that kind of stepped up to that, but that's because, you know, here, when I heard Blur, it was song number 2, which is still, you know, on the radio 50 million times a day across the United States. So it's like, I didn't know if that was something. So yeah, I didn't want to ask you about Oasis. Turn your phone off and storm out of the door.
I mean, there were a bunch, you know, there were a lot of little moments, but that was the big moment. You know, that's what moved. That's because up until that point, it was almost laughable that a band like us could even get in the charts. You know, that some of the UK-based music newspapers were writing like comedy sketches, imagining how laughable it would be if a band like Blur were in, you know, number 1 in the charts and started making some money, and, you know, might buy a nice house or a fast car or something, and, you know, what a ridiculous notion that would be, you know. And that's how it was. There was a separate chart for indie bands because they were so unlikely to get in the main chart. They invented the indie chart, which you had to sell about 3 records for to be number 1. were struggling to do that, you know, and then suddenly, as I say, the mainstream shifted, as it does from time to time. Seemed to me it happened very, very quickly, and everybody was looking to the next kind of you know, the next sort of musical wave, and we were it. And
yeah, that's
suddenly,
crazy.
you know, we've been to clubs, and there'd be paparazzi outside pushing us out of the way so they could take pictures of, you know, Kurt Cobain or something, and now they were outside of these clubs waiting for us. We come outside and they come over here, stand to the left, stand to the right, you know, the light bulbs flashing. Didn't last long, mind. You know?
Well, that could be overwhelming. I mean, wow, to just kind of have that happen. You're like, what? Now people want to take my picture, ask autographs, like that. Yeah, I can't even fathom what that would be like.
That's kind of quite bashful, has to be said. It's like, oh God, oh no, don't be famous. Hang on.
Well, I want to talk obviously about this album. So when do you start working on, like, what made you want to do a solo album?
Well, it was you know, I've carried on writing songs ever since those early days, but I think it was really the success of my film music career that gave me the confidence to do a solo album. And it was, unfortunately, because it was such a miserable thing, but COVID gave me the space to do it. Really, I found myself in the second lockdown sitting in my studio with nothing to do, and, you know, looking at potentially months ahead of me of you know, kind of empty days. And my friend Leah Abrams, a producer, and I had just decided we were going to work together on some project or something, you know, at some point. Probably neither of us actually meant it, you know, it's just kind of one of those things you say, but no, I think we meant it. But yeah, the time just never quite seemed to arrive, you know. And then suddenly we both sat in our studios going, well, let's do this now then. So we thought it was going to be too hard to do in two separate studios. So we thought, we can do some preparatory work now, you know, and then when the time is right, we can, you know, when the lockdown ends, we can actually get together and make the record. So we started this preparatory work, and 6 weeks later the album was finished. And it turned out to be a brutally efficient way of making a record. You know, we'd get together in the morning over Zoom, divvy up the tasks for the day, and then we would work throughout the day in our separate studios. Obviously, two studios means you can work twice as fast, and swap files throughout the course of the day, and swap ideas, and then get together in the evening and have a recap, see where we are. So it worked really well. What we missed out on was the ability to kind of be in the same room playing instruments together and kind of bounce ideas off each other. So that's quite a valuable thing to do, and that, had we both not been so experienced at making records, that might have been a problem. But you know, as it was, I think, you know, I would definitely do a hybrid approach next time around. So it's definitely valuable being in the same room, but equally it's very efficient being in separate rooms. So I probably do 50-50 of you know, a week together and a week apart, maybe.
Yeah, I've heard other artists talk about that, saying like, I never thought I could write an album, you know, away from the band, kind of. But then once it was happening and file sharing and everything, it was like, actually, this is pretty efficient.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because the tools that were advertised as being collaborative tools were hopeless. They were of no use whatsoever.
Oh, like sharing over, like when you were trying to play at the same time or something, like the latency and all that.
Was absolutely foolish. Yeah, there was some of the music software specifically marketed itself as being able to do that, and so, you know, that was the first thing we tried. We spent nearly a week struggling with getting that to work. Never managed it. You know, in the adverts, you know, you've got the singer in one studio singing in a microphone, and the producer in the other studio with the headphones on, giving him direction. No, absolutely not. So we had to evolve different ways. I think most musicians did, but it ended up, you know, when we got into the groove of it, it worked pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, did you have the same vision? Like, where you got, like, I mean, to have the album radio songs and kind of the way you describe it in your bio is just kind of, you know, turning the dial and kind of finding this this
Yeah.
wavelength. Like, was that an idea that you were you just kind of taking the lead and he would kind of jump in every once in a while, or like were you on the same vision for what the record would sound like?
Yeah, we discussed it. So, you know, we both knew what we needed to do. And that's another thing about, you know, both of us pretty experienced about this kind of stuff. So I was able to use words to explain what it was trying to achieve that he understood. And that's often the hard thing in the studio. You know, even with Blur, we've been playing together for 35 years, often explaining your vision for the thing to everybody else leads to a lot of hand waving and kind of, you know, but we, you know, we were, yeah, we both got it. There was some exploration along the way. Obviously, we went down some blind alleys, as you do with these things. It's not, you know, it's never a straight road that you stay on the whole time. But by and large, it was pretty clear that the songs were well, you know, reasonably well advanced. It wasn't like many of them were just an idea that had to be fleshed out. You know, and lots of other ideas bolted on. It was more kind of structural work, and then re-recording the things that needed to be re-recorded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such an amazing album. Like I said earlier, Black Sheep is my favorite song on the record, but like the whole thing going into it, did you know you wanted to write an album? Or because it's obviously super cohesive and in the way it goes all the way through from the first song to the last, and that's what I love about albums. And I feel like that's an art that's kind of getting lost with the singles and, you know, the one hits and type things happening now. But like going into this, did you know you wanted to put out an entire album, or did it just happen to flow like that?
No, I knew I wanted to put out an album, and some of the songs were pre-existing that I'd just written for fun. But I did go in for a bunch of writing sessions specifically for the record once I decided to do it. So
Okay.
yeah, much of it was written over the course of a couple of months of writing sessions. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's such a great record. I only have a couple more questions for you. I appreciate your time today, Dave. This has been
No
so much
worries.
fun. This has been great. Was there something just based off of the way that you two were working on the album? Like, do you feel like there's like a sound that you were able to create, or a moment that happened, or a song that you were able to put together in a certain way that you maybe wouldn't have happened the way that it did if you weren't doing the file sharing, or you wouldn't have that kind of soul time by yourself in the studio?
Yeah, I think the two really are HK, which is a kind of a musical journey.
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of cut up piece, really. It started out like the demo is a completely different song, really. And the two of us kind of swap things backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And what we ended up with was something really completely different. Now, had I been in the same room as Leo, I might have gone, no, hang on. No, we're straying too far from the path here, you know. But as it was quite an exciting journey to see, you know, when we were working on that track, to see what he was doing and for him to see what I was doing. But the other one is the last track on the album, which is
Who's Asking? That's a great song.
Yeah, that started life as a choral piece that I wrote for a film I was working on and ended up not getting used. So we decided to rework it as an orchestral piece, and you know, it was either going to start or end the album. But again, it's the Leo was really I had to give Leo quite a bit of license to do things that, you know, it was quite a short piece, and he extended it out in various different ways. And I probably, had we been in the same room together, me watching him do it, I would have probably gone, no, this is too much. It's just, hang on, it's too long. There's no way we're going to sustain people's interest over this kind of 3.5 minutes. This is just only a short thing. Let's just, you know, do it and then move on, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But as it was, he was quite right. And we got a superb orchestrator and conductor who conducts the London Contemporary Orchestra, who orchestrated our musings. And I went out to Budapest to watch to watch him conduct the Budapest Film Orchestra.
Wow.
And that was a really beautiful moment, you know, when you back in the room, like where I started, really, you know, what back in the room with the orchestra, listening to it all happening. That kind of evoked my early days and my childhood, you know, and all those years ago. So yeah, it was like sort of closing of a loop, really.
That's cool. What a cool experience to have again. Well,
Yeah,
again, like I said, David, thank you so much for doing this. You kind of, well, you did
pleasure.
answer this my last question earlier, but maybe your answer changed. Who knows? But I want to know if you have any advice for aspiring artists.
I can only give the advice that was given to me when I was an aspiring artist was that often it's the in life in general, but in music especially, it's the most tenacious people that succeed. You know, it's the 9 times out of 10 when things don't go the way of a struggling artist, that artist will give up and go and do something else. The ones who haven't given up are the only ones left who are still in the frame. So you know, if you really want it, if you want it more than anything else, simply plug away at it. Something will happen eventually. It usually does.